Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're looking at a pretty intense idea from a range of critical analyses. The argument that the Western world is sailing right into a perfect storm of converging crises. The sources we're examining are suggesting that a mix of economic instability, geopolitical chaos, and social fracturing is creating a situation that's, well, completely new territory for our lifetimes.
Okay, let's get right into it. The core idea, the central premise you'll find across all our sources is this really stark warning of systemic failure. Now, this isn't about just one problem. It's about how several massive crises are all feeding off each other, creating this incredibly dangerous and unpredictable environment.
So what's driving all this? According to former White House advisor Colonel Douglas Macgregor, it boils down to these three things. The argument is that endless wars are creating a level of debt that's just not sustainable. And that massive debt, in turn, is used to justify more and more governmental control. You see the feedback loop, right? It's a cycle that, according to him, just erodes prosperity and freedom.
To really drive their point home, the sources make this really striking historical comparison. They're basically mapping the conditions of the modern West right onto 18th century France, just before the French Revolution. I mean, think about it. France was the superpower of its day, but it was being hollowed out from the inside by pointless wars, a totally mismanaged economy, and a ruling class that the public just didn't trust anymore. The argument is that we're seeing a very similar kind of rot setting in today.
So is that comparison fair, or is it a little bit dramatic? Well, the sources we're looking at argue that yes, it's absolutely valid. And we're going to break down their argument into three distinct but totally interconnected pillars: the financial fault line, the geopolitical fracture, and the social collision.
All right, so the first pillar of this whole perfect storm idea is economic. And it starts with the very foundation of our economy, our money, and the absolute mountain of debt that's been built on top of it.
Just look at this number. This is the estimated price tag for foreign wars over the last couple of decades, according to Colonel Macgregor. It's a staggering amount of money that sources argue hasn't actually bought any stability overseas. Instead, it's fueled this colossal sovereign debt crisis right here at home. And that's basically when a country is in real danger of not being able to pay back its own government debt. Now, this incredible debt is part of a much bigger economic shift that the sources call financialization. In simple terms, it's an economy that makes more money from trading things and charging fees than it does from actually building things and developing people's skills.
And this slide really lays it out perfectly. The sources argue we've gone from what you could call production capitalism, the kind that built the country, to financial capitalism, which they say acts more like a giant casino. The focus of the economy is no longer on making stuff, but on speculating on stuff. And this whole shift, they say, is made possible by what they call fake money, currency that isn't really backed by anything tangible.
Financial analyst Peter Schiff argues this is all going to end in a crisis much, much worse than 2008. He believes this time the problem isn't going to be mortgages, it's going to be government debt itself. The core of his argument is that this threatens the US dollar's status as the world's reserve currency, which could shake the entire global financial system to its core.
Okay, so let's move on to the second pillar and see how this all connects. We're talking about the breakdown of the international order that's pretty much been in place since the Second World War.
The sources are incredibly critical of long-standing institutions like NATO. Colonel Macgregor goes so far as to call the alliance a terminal patient. He argues that it lost its original defensive purpose after the Cold War and has since turned into an offensive instrument that just keeps a very expensive and very destabilizing war machine running.
So the argument here is that these geopolitical strategies are failing on two fronts. First, they haven't achieved their goals abroad. They've created chaos, not order. And second, the immense cost has had severe economic consequences back home, which plugs right back into that financial fault line we were just talking about.
And that brings us to the third, and maybe the most volatile pillar identified in the sources: a deep internal fracturing of Western societies. This is where all those external pressures start to show up as conflicts at home.
Now, this line of argument, put forward by people like Charlie Downs and Colonel Macgregor, claims there's a huge cultural and demographic shift happening, but without any real public consent. They argue this is creating a massive disconnect between what they call globalist elites and the general population, and that this tension is now reaching a boiling point.
To try and put a number on this pressure, sources point to examples like this one: a €6 billion annual budget gap in the Netherlands' asylum policy. The point they're making isn't about the number of people arriving, but about a failure to build a sustainable infrastructure to support them, which creates this huge and, they say, avoidable financial strain.
The sources then point to a pattern of symptoms they claim are signs of this social breakdown. When you put them all together, they paint a picture of a society that's losing its shared identity, where governments are seen as working against their own people, and where this growing feeling of anger and dispossession is starting to take hold.
Journalist Charlie Downs really sums up a core feeling from the source material with this quote. The argument is that the multicultural model, at least as it's been put into practice, hasn't created social cohesion. Instead, they say, it's encouraged separate, often conflicting identities, which leads to division instead of unity.
So, how do these three huge crises, the financial one, the geopolitical one, and the social one, all come together in the final analysis?
Well, the sources contend that these aren't just separate issues happening at the same time. No, they're locked in a self-reinforcing vicious cycle. Unsustainable debt pays for the foreign war machine, which serves as a great distraction from the growing social crises at home. And then those crises get even worse because of the economic decay that's caused by all that debt and the loss of industry.
And this, of course, leads to the ultimate question posed by the sources. If the financial system is built on debt that can never be repaid, if the geopolitical order is broken, and if our societies are fracturing from the inside, is the whole system just unsustainable? Is some kind of collapse basically unavoidable at this point? And if the answer to that is yes, then what happens next? The sources suggest some kind of radical reset is coming. The argument is simply that the current path cannot continue. But what that reset actually looks like and who gets to control it, well, that's still the subject of some very intense debate.
Which leaves us with this final, very provocative thought from Colonel Macgregor. Will the fundamental changes that are needed happen peacefully, through the ballot box? Or, if that fails, will the pressure build until it leads to a revolutionary outcome, one fought with the cartridge box? That is the huge unresolved question at the very heart of this perfect storm thesis.